Today's lesson is all about limits theorem under basic calculus. Last time, we discussed about limits of a function using graph as well as using tables of values. This is another way of finding the limits of our function na hindi natin ginagamit yung tables of values as well as graph. So direct way on finding the limits of our function. And we have 8 theorems to discuss. 8 limits theorem to discuss in this lesson. So let's start with the first theorem. The first theorem is the limits of constant is itself. So anong ibig sabihin ng limits of constant is itself? Sabi dito, if k is any constant, then the limits of your constant as x approaches to c is equal to k. So we have your constant, sabi natin, the limits of constant is itself. So kapag meron tayong constant, ang magiging limits natin is the constant itself. Kaya meron tayong limits as k. Example. So we have limits of 2 as x approaches to c is equal to 2. Since our constant k is 2, therefore the limits of our function is equal to 2. Another one is if we have limits of negative 3.14 as x approaches to c, and then ang magiging limits natin is negative 3.14. And we have last one, limits of 789 as x approaches to c, that is equal to 789. So in finding the limits of constant, sinasabi doon, the limits of a constant is itself. So kaya meron tayong limits of 2 as x approaches to c is 2. Limits of negative 3.14 as x approaches to c is equal to negative 3.14, and so on. So that is the limits of constant is itself. The next theorem is all about the limits of x as x approaches to c is equal to c. Ngayon naman, kung kanina, ang ginamit natin ay constant k in getting the limits of our function. Ngayon naman, we are going to use this constant c sa pagkuha ng limits of our function. So sometimes, we can say that this is a substitution law because we simply substitute c doon sa value ng x natin. So we have here limits of x as x approaches to c is equal to c. So yung constant na yung naging limits natin dito. Like for example, we have limits of x as x approaches to 9, then our limits will be 9 since our constant c is equal to 9. Another one is limits of x as x approaches to 0.005. So our limit is 0.005 since the value of our c is equal to 0.005. And last one, we have limits of limits of x as x approaches to negative 10, that is equal to 10, since the value of our c is equal to 10. So that's how we get the limits of x as x approaches to c is equal to c. So the first two limits, madali lang yung first two limits natin. But for the remaining theorem na meron tayo, we will assume that the limits of f of x as x approaches to c is equal to L. So meron na siyang value. And limits of g of x as x approaches to c is equal to m. Kasi maaari magkaroon tayo ng we are going to get the limits of two functions sa mga susunod nating theorem. So, lagi tandaan ito. We have limits of f of x is equal to L and limits of g of x as x approaches to c is equal to m. So we have the third one. We have the constant multiple rule. So the limit, sabi dito, the limit of a multiple of a function is simply that multiple of the limits of a function. So meron tayo itong multiple and then meron din tayong function. Na kung saan, sabi natin, the limits of a multiple of your function is equal to or is simply the multiple of the limits of your function. So, lumabas na yung limits of f of x as x approaches to c na sinabi natin kanina, we assume that is equal to L. Kaya naman, if we have this condition that limits of f of x as x approaches to c is equal to 4, then we can say that limits of 8 multiplied by your function f of x as x approaches to c is equal to, ang gagawin natin, lalagyan natin sa unahan si 8, yung ating multiple. And then we have here, limits of 8 times the limits of your function as x approaches to c is equal to 8. So, kung mapapansin nyo, in this part, ay meron tayong value andun, which is equal to 4. Kaya nag-substitute tayo ng 4. Ayan. So, we have 8 times 4 that is equal to 32. So, the limits of our function is equal to 32. Another example, if we have negative 11 multiplied by your function, so we are going to find the limits of our function. So, same process, yung negative 11, ilalagay natin sa unahan, ayan, and then we have limits of f of x as x approaches to c. Again, meron tayong value nito, limits of f of x as x approaches to c, which is 4, kaya nag-substitute tayo ng 4. So, we have negative 11 times 4, that is equal to negative 44. And the last example, we have here 3 halves multiplied by your function. So again, yung 3 halves, lilipat natin. So we have 3 halves limits of f of x as x approaches to c. Meron tayong value nito which is 4. Kaya nag-substitute tayo ng 4. And then 3 halves multiplied by 4 is equal to 6. So by cancellation process, this is 2. 3 times 2, that is equal to 6. So that is the value of our, the limits of our function. So that's how we get the constant multiple theorem. The next theorem is all about addition theorem. Sabi dito, this say that the limits of the sum of your function, the limits of the sum of your function is equal to the limits of the individual function. So, kinuha natin yung limits of individual function. Not only in addition, but also in subtraction ay may i-apply natin ito. So, tinawag natin siya sa parehas na addition theorem doon sa parehas na operation natin, which is addition and subtraction. So, which is equal to L plus or minus M. Let's say that the value of our limits of f of x as x approaches to c is equal to 4. And limits of g of x as x approaches to c is equal to negative 5. Therefore, magkakaroon tayo dito ng same process na ginawa natin dito. Ayan yun. So, meron tayong value ng limits of x and limits of g of x, which is 4 and negative 5. So, we have 4 plus negative 5, that is equal to negative 1. And for subtraction naman, we have limits of f of x minus g of x as x approaches to c, and then yung individual limits of our function. So again, meron tayong value nito, which is 4 and negative 5 respectively. So we have 4 minus negative 5, that is equal to 9. Kasi negative multiplied by negative, that is positive. So we have 4 plus 5 is equal to 9. So, maaari din, when it comes to addition theorem, ay mauna yung g of x mo, or yung g of x, and susunod yung f of x. So, pwede mo balik tayo, depende sa given natin. So, possible yan. So, we have addition theorem. The next theorem is called multiplication theorem. So, same process with addition theorem. Ito, we just replace our operation by multiplication. So, ayan, same process lang yan. Nag-multiply tayo. So, the limits of the product of our function is equal to the limits of the product of individual limits of our function. Kaya meron tayong limits of f of x as x approaches to c multiplied with limits of g of x as x approaches to c is equal to L and M respectively. And again, using our value of limits of f of x as x approaches to c and limits of g of x as x approaches to c, which is 4 and 5, negative 5 respectively. So magkakaroon tayo dito ng 4 multiplied by negative 5 is equal to negative 20. So, almost the same process lang when it comes to addition theorem. So, that is multiplication theorem. Next, we have here division theorem. So, here in division theorem, this says that the limits of quotient of a function is equal to the quotient of the limits of individual functions. So the limits of the quotient of your function is equal to, so we have here individual function. So the quotient of the limits of individual function. And that is L all over M based on our representation kanina. So we have, if we have same value for limits of your function, limits of f of x as x approaches to c, and limits of g of x as x approaches to c, which is 4 and negative 5. So magkakaroon tayo dito ng 4 all over negative 5, or our answer is negative 4 over 5. So the limits of our function is negative 4 over 5. But you need to understand, or you need to remember, that the denominator in division theorem should not be equal to 0. Dapat hindi maging 0 yung denominator natin kasi magiging undefined na siya. Or ibig sabihin lang nun, the limits of our function does not exist, or DNE. Like for example, makikita natin in here, we have example. Itong last example natin, ayan. We have 4. Yung f of x natin is 4 and g of x natin ay 0. Na kung saan nagkaroon tayo ng 4 all over 0. Ibig sabihin, the limits of our function does not exist. So dito, meron tayong 0 and negative 5. So the answer is 0. So the limits exist. So 0 yung ating answer. So that's how we apply the division theorem. Next is the power theorem. When it comes to power theorem, sabi dito, this theorem states that the limit of an integer, power p, ayan, meron na tayong exponent, of a function is just that power of the limits of the function. Power of the limits of your function, or L raised to the power of p. Again, let's say that the value of limits of f of x as x approaches to c is equal to 4. Then we have here limits of f of x. So kung ang given natin ay limits of f of x cube as x approaches to c. So we have here, yung limits natin ay ilalagay natin sa loob para maging part siya ng cube natin, ng exponent. So we have limits of f of x as x approaches to c cube is equal to 4 cube, which is equal to 64. So the limits of our function is equal to 64. And also, we have here, if we also have same 4, and yun naman, negative yung exponent natin. Negative. Like, we have limits of your f of x raised to negative 2 as x approaches to c. And again, ipapasok ulit natin yung limits as x approaches to c para maging part siya ng ating exponent. So, magkakaroon tayo ng 4 raised to negative 2. Since we have negative exponent, kukunin natin yung reciprocal ng term natin, which is 4 raised to negative 2. So, reciprocal niya, ilalagay natin sa denominator, kaya magiging positive. So, we have 1 all over 4 squared, which is also equal to 1 over 60. So, that is the process kapag meron tayong negative exponent. Kailangan natin gawin siyang positive exponent. So, i-reciprocate lang natin yung ating term. Ayan. Next, the last theorem is all about radical or root theorem. So, this theorem states that if n is a positive integer, the limit of the nth root of a function is just that the nth root of the limits of a function. So, sabi dito, the limits of the nth root of your function is just that the nth root of the limits of our function. Or, simple natin ay nth root of L. Yung answer natin dun sa limits of f of x as x approaches to c. Diba? That is equal to L. And for example, if we have here the value of your limits of f of x as x approaches to c is equal to 4. So we have here, yung limits natin, ipapasok natin para mapabilang siya doon sa square root sign. And then, limits of our function is equal to 4, so that is square root of 4, which is equal to 2. Another one, if we have negative 4, this is negative 4. So, our function does not exist. Kasi nga, negative yung ating andon sa loob ng square root. Kasi sabi natin, dapat the nth root of the limit is real number. And the limit of a function must be positive. So, dapat positive ito para magkaroon ng limits ng function natin. Since this is negative, ibig sabihin, it does not exist. So, kailangan, condition na ma-meet natin when it comes to the different theorem na meron tayo. And these are the different limits theorem na may apply natin in finding the limits of your polynomial, radical, and rational function. And that's it. Thank you for listening and see you again.